everyone. Welcome to our first COAT talk in the series the AIA Monterey Bay is hosting, focused around the 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water. We hope to provide all 4 lectures to you this year. My name is Libby Barnes, and I am the Committee on the Environment Chair for our Monterey Bay chapter. Today's presentation is Fire Above and Beyond the Code. While we wish this could all be done in person, we are happy to be able to provide this webinar to you in the comforts of your home and office. Please use the Q&A feature for inquiries, and we'll do our best to address all of your comments and questions. We'll have about 15 minutes of questions at the end of our talk. This presentation will be available to view again, and Christy will post this on our AIA MB website in the COAT section when the presentation's ready to be uploaded. Before we get started, we would like to thank our sponsors who support our efforts. If you think any local companies who are not currently a sponsor but would be interested in being a sponsor or an allied member, please direct them to our website. And if any of you want to be an active member of the COAT committee working on sustainable education programs, lectures, city initiatives, and other ways to improve our communities, please email me. There are many ways you can help make a difference. When the Australian fires of 2019 and early 2020 were front page news, I knew fire would be the first in the COAT series. And now that here in California, we are officially in fire season, our hope is to provide you with some new ideas and techniques at reducing fire risk for our clients. Over the course of 6+ months, brush fires that started in Queensland and New South Wales due to increasing temperatures and a prolonged drought throughout Australia decimated more than 72,000 square miles of land, roughly the same area as the entire country of Syria. At least 3,500 homes and thousands of other buildings were lost, and 34 people died in thousands of fires between June 2019 and March 2020, and more than 1 billion animals were known to have been killed. Closer to home, we've seen many wildfires over the past few years that have ravaged wildland urban communities here in California. The Camp Fire of 2018 was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history, and the most expensive natural disaster in the world in 2018 in terms of insured losses. Investigations determined that PG&E power line failures during high winds caused many of the fires. The fire carried on gusts clocking 50 miles per hour on the homes and low-lying vegetation. This fire spread from house to house, which generated a force of their own. This fire covered an area approximately 240 square miles, caused 85 civilian fatalities, and destroyed 18,804 structures, with most of the damage occurring within the first 4 hours. The towns of Paradise and Concau were almost completely destroyed, as we see in this slide, each losing about 95% of structures in town. As we have seen over the course of the past 10 years, wildfires have increased in intensity and area due to the effects of global warming and overzealous fire suppression or limiting controlled burns. Property damage has increased as populations and home building move into WUI areas. As fire insurance companies have been more and more reluctant to insure homeowners in WUI areas. What resources do we have to combat wildfires? A lot, actually, we'll see today. While we also should strive to work together towards reducing the speed of global warming, we must also sharpen our focus on how to protect our built environment from fires. Our first speakers are architect and landscape architect and board member Katie Spitz, along with landscape architect Marie Goulet. principal of Wildland Workshop. They will speak on fire resilience in the landscape. I'll turn this presentation over to Katie and Marie.
Hi, everybody. I like to start with this image because we live in the most populous state in the country. There are 40 million of us, and many of us are here because of the immense beauty of the state. But in addition to that beauty, California is a land, it's a land of extremes. And one of those extremes is fire. Fire is an essential component for our ecology. In order to thrive, our ecologies must burn. In fact, they co-evolved with fire, as many of you know. And since we can't eliminate fire, we have to make fire our friend. And as the Tassajara monks said when they defended their retreat against the Soberanes Fire, they said, "We're meeting the fire, letting the fire come to us. We're making friends with it and taming it as it reaches our boundaries." Because in fact, living with fire means making it our friend. So today we're going to talk about an integrated approach to designing fire resilient landscapes. We're going to consider all the aspects of a project on its site, from landscape, from setting, from ecology, to the engineering, and put that all together to create healthy biodiverse sites which are more fire resistant. By reducing fuel volume and preserving design, we can create more resilient landscapes. We can retain healthy native vegetation, avoid erosion, and maintain habitats. And those are our goals, creating fire-safe landscapes. So today we're going to divide our talk into three parts, Marie and I. The first part is Fire Basics and Defensible Space. That's Chapter 7A of the California Building Code. We're going to review ecological and design strategies. And we're going to then look at examples of fire defensive buildings and landscapes, which is kind of the fun part, how it's done. So by way of a little bit of background, California, as you know, was, as I said, was co-evolved with fire. Fire was used by the Native Americans, existed naturally, and now we no longer have fires. And why is that? We had laws that broke up the resilient growth forests. Grazing destroyed the hydrology of our grasslands. We now have invasive native grasses, which are highly flammable, where we used to have long, deep-rooted native grasses. We don't burn anymore. We have suppression. And most importantly, urban sprawl has invaded the lands. And what Marie was talking about, the wildlife-urban interface, WUI, we are now living where California has to burn. So it's a complex issue. Here is a map showing you some of the WUI areas throughout and then it really focuses on Los Angeles because this is an issue for the entire state and it affects urban areas like Oakland, Pacific Palisades. All the fires that we're now having are not just wildfires, they're not just house fires, they're a combination. So a little bit about basics, Fire 101. In order to have a fire, and Seth is the expert on this, you need three components. None of us can affect the weather. Fuel, which means anything that can burn on a site, whether it's your house, your plant materials, whatever can burn will burn. And topography, which is the shape of the site. And as designers, we can't affect the weather, and we can't affect the topography per se, but by deciding where we build and how we build, we can affect the fuel and we can affect the topography in terms of how we site our buildings. So we have a lot of control over how fire resilient our sites are. And it's important to remember that we're talking about fire resiliency. Everything will burn in California, and we may not be able to make it a 100% safe environment. Chapter 7A has divided sites into three zones. It has if you start with the house out on this little diagram, you'll see there's an ignition zone, which happens to be spelled wrong on this slide, I realize. I didn't do this. The ignition zone is a non-combustible area, absolutely nothing combustible. And if you insist on putting a plant there, as many of us plant lovers do, try and use a succulent. The second zone is 30 feet from the structure, and I'll go into what goes into these zones. And the third zone, the 100 feet from this structure, is the reduced fire zone. So zone 1, which is the 5 foot, is really extension of your architecture into the landscape. It's totally non-combustible. It's hardscape or succulents. Zone 2, low growing plants. And one thing that's important to know is that flame heights are twice what your plant height is. Flame heights are twice. So if you use plants that are 2 feet or under, you have 4 foot flames. Interrupt fire paths. Marie's going to talk about all of this. Removing and pruning dead plants, keeping branches from over your roof, trimming trees to keep fire ladders away, relocating your wood piles in your to further away from your house. And then zone 3 is they say keep annual grass down to a minimum of 4 inches, horizontal space between trees and shrubs, and creating vertical space between grass, trees, and shrubs, which is that fire ladder. So this is a map. It's only a partial map of California. I couldn't fit all of California on the slide, but these are the WUI zones. This is a CAL FIRE map. So these are the WUI zones, and red, orange, and yellow are designated WUI. Green is a natural forest, and white and gray are local jurisdiction and are often also designated WUI. So you can see that most of California has with fire defensiveness. And this is just a quick diagram to show you that idea of the plant height and the flame height and the distance. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Marie. The important thing that you know is this is not a recipe. It's not a prescription. There's no one thing you can do. If you're starting a project from scratch, what you can do is sit down with everybody that's involved with that project, from your architect, your engineers, the planner, from whoever you need to get involved with, the client, so that you all agree on a strategic approach to fire resiliency. And now we turn it over to Marie.
Hi, everybody. So as Katie suggests, defensible space starts with site design, and this is where architects and landscape architects and other team members can work together during all design phases to understand how to create a fire defensible property. And that really starts with the site analysis and siting the building in smart places and working with the existing site to design it as safe as possible. Wildfires start from really hot wind and steep terrain, and so that's something to avoid. So fires tend to move really fast up slopes, and steep, hot, south-facing slopes are places where if we can avoid to build, we should. If we can't avoid it, then we should consider increasing the defensible space in requirements by widening the defensible space zones and even considering fire suppression systems within the landscape. Anything that burns is really considered fuel. And in our California climate, we've had a long history of indigenous people burning and prescribing burns to control larger fires. And now that that isn't happening anymore, we have a lot of old dead material that's been accumulating for years and years, creating large fire events. So wherever we are building, we should try to limit the amount of dead, old plant material if possible. Our rare and diverse native plant communities are also fuel, and it's really important to preserve these resources. So hiring biologists, landscape architects, and knowledgeable contractors who understand that and who are careful about how they create defensible space is really important when we're building within our plant communities. In Monterey County, we are lucky to have a really diverse range of these plant communities. We're in California is in the California Floristic Province, which is a world biodiversity hotspot. And as professionals, architects, landscape architects, et cetera, working within these landscapes, we have a duty to protect and preserve them wherever possible. Each ecology burns a little bit differently and call for a different prescription for how to deal with creating defensible space within them. So we can't control topography or weather, but we can control the quantity and the arrangement of fuels and fuel types within our built environment. And that's where planning and site analysis really comes into play. I'm going to go through a couple of these main plant communities, just talk about specifics on how to deal with them and about their ecology. So the Monterey Pine Forest is a rare and endemic plant community found in Monterey County and a couple other places. And it's very rare. There's not very much left, and it's very adapted to fire. It burns very quickly, and it regenerates itself mainly when there is a fire of medium and high intensity. That's when the pine cones can actually release seeds. So when building in pine forests, it's important to try to preserve the trees that are left, which is contrary to what you want to do because pine trees are incredibly flammable. So the defensible space requirements within these zones is extreme. You have to keep the understory really low and free of dead plant material as much as possible, trying to limb the trees up quite a bit so that there's absolutely as little chance of fire ladders as possible. And mimicking the way fire acts within the landscape as you're clearing is one way to do it too. So creating islands of vegetation that are far away from each other as much as possible. Oak Woodlands and Oak Savannah is a really common plant community throughout California. It's very beautiful and it's very resilient to fire. It burns slowly and is usually found on north-facing slopes, so it's not usually as hot. And they're also adapted and reliant on the fire regime, as all of our plant communities are. And one really key thing about clearing in oak woodlands is to not go too crazy with the clearing and over prune the canopy, because that actually creates additional conditions for weeds and understory to grow. Our coastal scrub and similarly our chaparral plant communities are a beautiful, diverse, vibrant plant community that can burn very, very hot and fast if it's not maintained. When young or trimmed, both of these plant communities are actually pretty slow burning, but it's when they develop a large amount of dead plant material over time that they become really big furnaces in a fire. So maintaining coastal scrub it involves trimming that old stuff back, and often when you actually cut down to the ground, it will grow back again into this beautiful, lush version of coastal scrub. So if you have a low budget, and you're developing within coastal scrub and chaparral, it's actually really easy to create a really cheap garden through just maintaining what's already there, increasing the spacing between plants, and just maintaining that space by weed whacking it down to the ground before fire season starts. And that's just an ongoing process every 3 to 5 years or so. Our beautiful grasslands and coastal prairies are some of the most endangered plant communities in California. This used to be all over the state, and it just so happens we like to develop within them. And so when you find an intact native grassland, it's really important to keep it there or restore it. They have native bunch grasses have really deep roots that hold onto the soil, and they resprout over the fire after a fire. So they're really good at soil stabilization. And a wide variety of native grasses are now used within landscaping. And they do really good job of blending into native sites. If timed correctly, when you're mowing a native grassland in the springtime at maybe 6 inches high, depending on the species, it goes to seed and flowers again later in the summer, and it helps to extend that green, spring green into the summer. So it's actually an aesthetic benefit as well. We need to work with what we have to create landscapes that blend with surrounding context and add back what has been taken away through developing these lands. So we can do that safely when we understand these prescriptions and create defensible space within them. Another strategy while planning properties within the WUI and other places is to think holistically about your planning process. And using your program to create additional defensible space and site resiliency into every project. So thinking about gray water and rainwater collection and reuse helps to increase your soil moisture and your plant moisture on your property, and obviously designing irrigation systems to keep your plants wet in fire season. Locating driveways and pools, patios, sports courts, anything that's large and not planted and useful can be a fire break, and locating those places where you have the biggest chance of a fire moving towards your house is a good way to go. And also looking at it in a more contextual way where you're thinking about how your planting and your layout affects your neighbors. You can also think about arranging and designing your sites for resiliency through your planting palette and your planting choices. Anytime you create a vegetable garden, you're creating a space that's going to provide food and also less chances of having a fire in that location. So creating resilient sites that are water conserving and food producing, habitat creating workhorses aid in preparing them for fires and other natural disasters, and can also help prevent them. As the pandemic drags on, COVID victory gardens are springing up everywhere to help save a trip to the dreaded grocery store, and it also just makes people happy. Some characteristics of fire-resistant plants are really common throughout our plant communities, which are thick leaves to hold the moisture through the dry season, and things that are very low and have high mineral content so that your flame heights aren't high. And there are a lot of resources for how to choose these plants, lots of different lists, and we listed some of those resources in the end of this presentation. But there are a lot of great lists to start with, but there's also a lot of lists that list the really flammable plants that you want to stay away from or trim away from what's already on site, like California Bay and chamise and old black sage and pines. So being really careful about where those are planted or where those are allowed to remain on a site is important during the planning and maintaining process. The taller the plant, the higher the flame, as Katie mentioned. The flame height is twice the height of the plant itself. So it's important to understand that when planning different arrangements, and the way that we arrange them and the way that they are maintained is really critical to keeping defensible space working correctly. And landscapes that are planned accurately can actually become a resource in the event of a fire, where smothering embers and stopping the spread of a fire towards a structure can actually be seen. It's critical to understand how to maintain trees within the defensible space zones. And trees can be an asset, and they're also liabilities. So it's important for improving our livelihoods and our environment that they are maintained properly and that they're kept in the landscape for comfort and habitat. And it's important to work out from the house to clear branches from roof lines and keep them limbed up to avoid fire ladders, but also to not be overzealous with the pruning. Similarly, weeds can burn incredibly fast, and when you are over clearing on your property, you can actually invite more to come in. And so it's important to try to, again, be really careful and strategic about what you're removing and what you're keeping and how it's going to respond to a fire if a fire comes. And it's also important to work with someone who understands what's invasive and what will work and what will not on a particular site, so that you're not accidentally adding invasives to your property. So I might be biased, but I think we all should be celebrating our native plants with every property we're allowed to work in. And above all, create diversity. Just as cultural diversity is important for our thriving world, biodiversity is key to supporting the world future generations depend on. And it has a lot of really good benefits for us now too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to to Katie, who's going to look at or give us some examples of some of these beautiful, successful, defensible properties. Katie, on to you.
Oh,
Katie,
you're muted, Katie.
I think you're on mute.
Now I'm muted. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second because I realize I am not far enough along. I was listening to Marie rather than slides appropriately, so that is my fault. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to sharing. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, let's try that again. So here's some very fun projects to look at that are all about fire resiliency. The first one is going back to the past. It's one of the earliest projects that really addressed fire resiliency in its totality. It's Roland Coates' 1974 house that he built in Romero Canyon in Montecito. He built it for Jesse Alexander, who was a filmmaker. The house is entirely concrete and steel. They removed tons and tons of soil from the site, and then they backfilled the soil back onto the site. And it was most recently owned by Steve Martin, so it's a very desirable piece of property. I think he sold it. And it's a really beautiful example of total fire resiliency. Another project in Australia, many of you know Glenn Murcott's work, an architect. This is an example of both the way he very lightly touches the ground, but this is a fire-resistant house. It's all steel and glass. The structural members are held above the ground with fire-resistant cladding, and it's probably from the 80s, I believe. So it's another example. Another one in Australia is the Carey Firehouse. This one's quite interesting. You can see that the landscape here is respecting the native landscape. It is in a eucalyptus grove. We tend to vilify eucalyptus here. They do light very easily, but they are native to Australia, and so this house is in that grove. It's all steel and glass, and actually what's really interesting that in some cases he uses material from firefighters' fire-resistant clothing underside some of his decks as a way to promote even greater fire resiliency. So there's a lot of creative use of materials involved in what we're talking about. This project is, Barton Myers is the architect. It's clearly set in an oak grove. It does exactly as Marie said. You can see the nice clear ground plane of mulch below the oaks, natural mulch, not wood chips. You can see that the oaks are pruned up quite high. They're laced out, but they're not over pruned. And the building itself is concrete. It has a water pond on the roof. The screen doors, steel screen doors, roll down in case of fire. And he designed it specifically with fire in mind. And I think he and Vicki, his wife, were the designers of the landscape as well as the house. This is one that's more recent in Montecito by Tom Kundig. You can see its setting, a magnificent setting, very native. It's that coastal scrub and grassland that Marie referenced. There's a pool. Seth will tell us a pool will not save us from fires, but there is a pool as a last resort. He calls it a Hail Mary. You can see the fireproof treatment of the driveway with the Corten steel and the very, very minimal planting at the entrance to the house. Once again, steel and glass and heavy timbers. This is the house that Tom Main just completed for himself in Los Angeles. It's a very different ecology. What is interesting here is because he recycled water in his project, he had water he had to use every single day. So we could really capitalize on using a very tropical plant palette for that house, which worked perfectly. You can also see that the 5-foot non-combustible zone next to the house is actually water in this case. You can see the metal, perforated metal cladding, and most of the rest of the house is actually concrete. You can also see gravel was used as a, instead of mulch, I should say, for the courtyard. And one of the things that really horrified me was when I found out that mulch actually, wood chips actually catch fire or catch embers and are dangerous, so we shouldn't be using them. Other examples of outdoor living that are fire resilient are outdoor courtyards, which you can see here. This is the one on your right is a commercial property where they have a bocce court. The trees, which happen to be eucalyptus, are pruned way up. There's grasses, which are low, and places for people to gather. Because what we do with fire resiliency has to do not just with residential, it has to do with any time we're building in the wildfire urban interface. That project on the lower left is a deck suspended over a landscape, but the deck is out of concrete, which makes it relatively inflammable. And then again, another courtyard with a pool. So we also want to maintain healthy biodiverse sites. And in order to do that, we need to address how water moves through them. We need to, as Marie said, we can start to think about growing our food. We can start to think about ways to engage and use our driveways. And that's what you see here. Driveways are really important because if a firefighter can't get onto your site, he or she is not going to stay there to fight it. So you need to let it be easy for them to come in and make it easy for you to get out. Maintaining high tree canopies, think of them as little fire breaks, but you can also think of them as places to live, ways as almost outdoor patios. And then low flame height gardens. I mean, no one ever comes and says, I'd like you to design a low flame height garden for me. But there are many ways to do it and have it be really beautiful. And what you see here are a lot of native and annual plants. They're quite low, they die back, and they look glorious. You can see in the Studio Chicotense 2 projects that the planting is very low. The trees are pruned high, so it's relatively fire safe. In the Los Angeles project, there's a large area of decomposed granite in front of the house, and then very drought tolerant plants surrounding it, which are also low. And once again, looking at these in terms of not just houses, but in terms of commercial projects and institutional projects, all these same principles can apply. And so in conclusion, fire resilient gardens are not just gardens that are about fire. They're gardens that are about biodiversity. They're about healthy places to live. They're about making use of our outdoor space. It's getting more and more rare to actually have outdoor space. And now that we're in COVID, we really appreciate what it means if you're not living in an apartment. And so with that, we'll turn it over to Seth.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say thanks. Really enjoyed your presentations, ladies. I wanted to start with kind of titled my discussion as Learning to Live with Fire. And I wanted to start with an introduction of the history of fire. So there's been long periods of time with little or no fire, as well as times with great conflagration. Early Earth is thought to have been completely covered by water, and it is believed that electrical storms igniting dry seaweed were the first fires. Later, there were periods of violent volcanic activity, events like comet hitting Earth that set the planet ablaze. So as recently as 200 years ago, fire activity was far greater than we're seeing today. I like to point out the Great Chicago Fire. Most everyone's heard of that. It started on October 8th, and in 2 days, it killed 300 people and destroyed 3.3 square miles, displacing another 100,000 people in 2 days. So most everybody knows about that fire. But the same day that the Chicago Fire started, there's the Pistigo Fire. And that actually is the worst fire in America's history. And in one day, in 24 hours, it burnt 1.2 million acres and killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people. They're not sure because everything was destroyed. They couldn't even count the bodies. The fire tornadoes were so strong, so powerful that it lifted up train cars and strewn them around the city. So the last 100 years have been relatively mild fire conditions, and what we've come to know as normal may be the aberration, and it appears to be getting more active. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the next 100 years going to look like? It seems like it's getting hotter. It seems like there's bigger fires. So, we ought to be thinking about that in our designing and our building and our placement of buildings. So,
Seth, before you continue with your talk, I didn't get to properly introduce you.
Okay.
So I'm going to just jump back for a second, and then you can continue because I want to keep this momentum here. But everyone, this is Seth. I apologize for the phone ringing. Seth Parker, a California native, has spent the greater part of his life in Big Sur. Apologize and really take my volume down here. Okay. Has spent the greater part of his life in Big Sur. During his tenure there, he was exposed to and at times defended defended against recurring wildfires. He has a CAL FIRE certified licensed timber operator, an arborist, a certified water auditor, and an NFPA certified structural ignition specialist. Seth owns his own construction company, Pacific Land, Water, and Home, as well as Pacific Fire Management, and lives in Carmel. Seth is going to speak on living with fire and ways to help mitigate it on our properties. Seth was just talking about two different fires in our nation's history, and I can have you finish on the Pistigo Fire. But just to let everyone know, on the screen here, we have the Soberanes Fire in Big Sur from 2016. The Soberanes Fire was likely started by an illegal campfire at Soberanes State Park. The fire lasted 3 months, destroyed 57 homes and 11 outbuildings, and covered 71,954 square miles. On the screen is a photo of the house I live on the first night the fire came through. The home is located one ridge south of Soberanes. The first night in July was the most severe, but as you can see in the second photos, the fire continued to spread within the property for weeks after. What saved this house were a number of key factors. One, the house, built in 2010, followed the requirements of the Wildland Urban Interface Code. So it's made of cement board siding, metal roof, tempered windows. The home's location, specifically its elevation, which avoided the path of fury on the first night. We maintain proper fire clearance throughout the year. And because it is impossible to insure a house in a WUI area, an external fire suppression system was installed along the periphery of the yard surrounding the house. Okay, so I'll pass that over to you now, Seth. Thank you.
So that's a great segue, because my next kind of topic is understanding place and placement. It's critical. As an example, you want to avoid building where trees and vegetation compete for the same space. Building in and amongst the trees can lead to increased exposure to risk, as well as the need to be, more of an influence on the existing landscape. And what we really want to strive to do is integrate, right? So we want to cohabitate with our environment, both landscape and fire and weather and water, rain, all that stuff. What we're trying to do is find this balance, right? Instead of being competing with all these things. Another reason is expense. Vegetation management is costly and ongoing. So wherever possible, native and drought tolerant options should be used and located so that at maturity they fit their space and do not regularly need to be maintained. I always say I like my plants to serve me. I don't like to serve my plants. So, if you can keep that in mind while designing, it's really helpful, because your design, money is always a concern, right? Resource. And so your design might fail because somebody doesn't want to pay for proper maintenance, right? So try and think of that in advance and enable that that landscape to flourish, or that home, the same thing, So geography and aspect, I think Marie mentioned that, but so fire goes where water flows. That's one of the old firefighting sayings. So if you build at the top of a drainage, guess what? When the fire comes, it's going to shoot up that drainage and fire at your house. You don't want to place your house there, right? You want to think about things like that before you design the house. A building sites aspect, again, Marie mentioned this, but if you're on the north side, you have a lot less drying, heat exposure, wind exposure, and this can really benefit you over the long term. Another thing that's really important is fire history. Know your place. Know what's happened before. Oftentimes, fire it kind of repeats. It follows the same pattern over and over again. So if you can understand perhaps what that fire is going to do, you may put more defenses on one side, or move the house further back, or if nothing else, you may leave sooner because you know that the fire is coming right at you. So it's really important to understand the history. And then what you want to do is plan for resilience. So a really good way to start is, before you're even building, is do a fire management plan. And FMP is going to look at the site's history, location, resources, vegetation, and even more. And it's going to help you make an informed recommendation to minimize risk to life and property. An FMP can provide a streamlined process for vegetation management and permitting. If your local RMA accepts the FMP, it should provide vegetation management guidance for future owners, for landscapers that are maintaining the yard. and can also assist in, for instance, if you need to remove a tree that might be protected, if it's consistent with your vegetation, your fire management plan, it could be as simple as, you know, writing an addendum or an amendment and getting an over-the-counter permit where, you know, you may have been prevented if you hadn't had that in place. So having said that, I want to talk about the HIZ for a minute. This is really critical to understanding, you know, how to design and why. So there's a guy named Jack Cohen. I encourage you all to look up on YouTube. He's got a bunch of videos and they're really informative. It's just amazing to see this stuff actually happen. But up in the Great White North, Eastern Canada, they did these live fire tests where they took 10-acre tracts of timber and they built siding, which represented houses at different distances. And then they'd set the 10 acres on fire and see what happened, see how they reacted. And so the HIZ is, generally speaking, it's 130 and 5 feet, right? So we'll start with the 100. So there's really three kinds of kind of fire ignition things that we're worried about, right? There's the 200-foot, 2,000-degree crowning fire, which is basically the one that CAL FIRE gets in their trucks and drives away from, right? You drop borax from a plane on, and that's about all you do. That fire at 100 feet, they had wood siding. At 100 feet, there was no char. The 2,000-degree, think about that for a second, 2,000-degree, 200-foot flame at 100 feet, your house didn't even burn, right? No char. At that same distance, you and I would get a 2nd-degree sunburn in about 20 to 30 seconds. So our perception of what that house can take is a little bit off, right? Keep that in mind. So then we go down to the 30 to 5 feet. That's that middle range. So out at that 100 feet, you can have trees, you can have a forest, right? At that 100 down to a 30 feet, you want to break up the canopy, break up the continuity, and clean up that understory. Because what will happen is that crowning fire will rush in, and fire's hungry. It's looking for fuel, right? It's looking for wood to burn. So if you remove that fuel, it'll follow very much like water, that path of least resistance, right? If there's more food over here, it's going to go that way. So limbing up those trees. The other thing is a crowning fire needs a ground fire to sustain it. So if there's no ground fire and the fire is up in the top of the tree, it'll drop and go out. So that's why in that 100 feet, you start the canopy separation and clean the ladder fuels and understory. At 30 feet, the crowning fire will actually ignite the siding. But within about 50 seconds, as it burns on and away from that structure, the radiant heat will drop and it can't sustain the fire on the building. So the fire goes out. You get a little burn, but that's no big deal. At 30 feet, your house will ignite and then go out as fire burns away, okay? That's big news. So then we get down to the 0 to 5 feet. So the 0 to 5 feet is about low intensity ground fire and embers, okay? So here's an incredible figure. 9 out of 10 structures lost due to wildfire are due to low intensity ground fire and embers. The one little caveat is when the house next door to yours lights from embers or low intensity ground fire, it often ignites your house, much like the Paradise Fire where they burn structure to structure to structure. But initially, that initial fire, 9 out of 10 times is started by low intensity ground fire and embers. So if you have 5 feet of clear space from your building, a low intensity ground fire does not generate enough radiant heat to ignite your building, okay? And if you don't have a plant sitting next to your house under your eave that ignites from embers or whatever else, your house is going to be fine from embers and low intensity ground fire. You have to be careful of things like decks and other structures that run back to your house too, because they can ignite and lead that fire back to it. So there's the HIZ in general, and I just want to kind of put that out there so people understand where those numbers come from and how to use them, right? So we can coexist with wildfire if we just follow some simple guidelines, okay? And the first is, landscapes should be more than adornment. They are living systems, and they either aid or compromise your home's resilience. Structures should be built with survivability as a design criteria. There was the Toro Canyon house. Windows are a real vulnerability in fire. They built that house with roll down metal blinds to protect those windows. That's survivability. That's proactively preparing for what's coming. So when it comes, it's not a problem, okay? An autonomous external fire suppression system can close the final gap. Here's the deal. If you do your structural hardening, if you build your house right, and you do your vegetation management, your landscape is all set up, you should be able to defend your house with a garden hose. Problem is we get evacuated, we're asleep, we're on vacation, there's a million more, right? You can't get to the hose to put out those little fires. So an external fire suppression system is highly recommended. It closes the gap when you can't do it. I think Libby will attest to the value there. The final thing is like, this is how you do it, right? You plan, you implement, and you maintain and repeat. You want to reevaluate because everything is dynamic. Who knows what the neighbor does, or what the last fire did, or whatever that dynamism is, you need to take it into consideration as you move into the future. And lastly, when you're making these plans, when you're putting it all together, try and get into the seasonality of things. And I always tell people, if you're going to do vegetation management, if you're going to do a lot of clearing, winter's a great time. It's cooler. You can carry stuff downhill a lot of times instead of uphill. You can make small piles and do burning on site instead of having to take it off. Chipping oftentimes is a solution, but what happens is if you have a bunch of undecomposed chips on the ground and fire comes, they ignite and they go airborne and they're ember storms. So, again, if you treat that vegetation in the winter, even if you chip, it tends to break down and kind of become part of the soil better than if you do it in the summer. So if you can get into just kind of a natural rhythm of things, it will benefit your basically your bottom line as well as your outcome. And I think that's about it for me, guys.
Thank you.
You have any questions or anything? I can kind of went through a lot really quick.
Seth, the other day, I have a question. You talked about how we think that houses start with roof fires, but that in fact that's not what really happens. Could you talk a little bit about roofing?
Yeah, so again, I'll mention Cohen. If you go on YouTube, he'll actually go on top of houses and light fires, and he just shows that it's really hard to light a house on fire from the roof. Heat rises, right? So roofs are actually a lot less vulnerable than you think. What happens, and where this kind of the urban myth comes from, is from shake roofs, right? And you get these spaces where an ember gets lodged in there. And so there's three kinds of heat, right? There's conductive, radiant, and convective. Convective is the wind, right? You know that from baking. It's pretty effective. It moves the heat pretty well. Conductive is the ember that's, leaning against your house or your porch or whatever, and it ignites it. what they found about that, which is really important in terms of structural hardening, is mass. Anything under about 1/8 of an inch doesn't have enough mass to ignite anything. So if you keep your screening, your venting, and everything under 1/8 of an inch, anything that gets sucked in there won't light your house on fire. Currently, pretty much everybody has a 1/4 inch screening on their vents, so it's a real weak spot. Another one that's really people don't like eaves, right? They say, oh, you got to be careful of eaves. Close up the eaves. Close up the rafters. It's not exactly true. So what happens is, if you put an ember and you blow it up into an eave, as soon as the wind changes, it drops to the ground. So the eaves are not really that big a fire risk. What the risk is putting a plant under them so that they burn and that heat gets trapped in that area, right? And it creates a kind of a vortex, and poof, then your house is on fire. And the other big one is I always tell people, don't put plants by windows. If you have to put a plant by a window, consider putting it in a pot so you can move it away. Windows are one of the most vulnerable places on a house. They expand really quickly, and the frames don't. They crack, drop out, and then embers blow in your house, and your house catches on fire. So
that's great. Seth, we have a couple questions, so I'm going to start asking them to you guys. One of the comments, for existing homes, and so great presentations, kudos to you guys. For existing homes in fire vulnerable areas, what would you suggest as a priority list of things the homeowner can do to retrofit an existing structure? And this question goes to all panelists.
I'll start. The thing is you have to look at each house individually. Every home has its own kind of, vulnerabilities, and that's where, you have to start with looking at that place, right? But having said that, vegetation, keep it away from the house. Things like wood fences that run back to your house, they provide an uninterrupted kind of road to the structure. So the other one I mentioned is screens. That one's huge. Decks. Anywhere that you have an area that you can't get into to clean is a vulnerability. Likely as not, wind will blow leaves or something in there, and that's where an ember will end up. And what happens a lot of times with these ember fires is, the head of the fire will run by the neighborhood, and all the firemen are fighting it and putting out houses that are catching, and they run along with the fire, and the fire moves on. And there's a little ember stuck, in your deck or under your house or, in some little corner. And a day or two later, it's sitting in there just kind of coaling away. And a day or two later, that conductive heat actually erupts and poof, your house catches on fire. And there's no one around to put it out or to notice. And that's where your structure gets lost because everybody's moved on with the fire. Embers can travel for miles. So, so look for ember traps. The other thing I like to mention, a little cheat is walk around your house and look for leaf piles. I always say make a plan, right? Before the fire's there, think about what you'd like to do, because when the fire's there, it's hard to think. You get really dumb really fast. But so back to the leaves, if you walk around and look where the leaf piles are, and you're home with your garden hose, and you've marked down where all the leaf piles build, guess what? You take your garden hose and you go to those spots because that's where the embers are going to blow, right? And you can just douse them, check those spots. And one of the things that happens by having a plan, it's really amazing, is you feel you're much more at peace. You're much more confident. You're not, panicking and freaked out and what am I forgetting and whatever. If you have a list to refer to, you march down the list and you've done it. And so that's a really big thing for people, is to not just think what you're going to do before the fire comes, but also think what you're going to do when the fire's there.
That's great. Yeah, I think Seth, really looking at those 5 feet seems really critical. I know, like for the Paradise Fire, like even keeping your recyclables under the eave of your house where you have cardboard and such is not good. Jute mats, anything that is flammable. And you mentioned decks. A lot of us have decks. And in the WUI code, they require some kind of impervious material underneath your deck. So whether you put gravel or stone or something to prevent the fire from coming up underneath the deck is another technique.
Yeah, something I frequently run into. They're supposed to be 6 inches below siding before soil starts, and regularly someone will plant the siding will be under the soil, or right up to the soil, and that's a entrance point for rot and termites, as well as fire. If that coal blows along the surface of the ground and then hits the bottom of the siding, it can ignite it. If it blows across the bottom of the ground and hits a little cement block or footing, it's not going to ignite. So that's really important too.
Okay, great. I'm going to go with a couple more questions. We have a question back to the landscape architects. One thing about creating islands with bare ground between is not especially habitat friendly. For instance, quail and other critters need large swaths for habitat. Secondly, the dreaded ice plant is non-native and invasive, but potentially a good fire break on slopes. How does one determine direction in creating habitat-friendly plantings while protecting from fire? Katie and Marie, do you have a answer for that?
I'll start and then Marie can kick in. I think, first of all, some native California bees do require bare earth. So we're doing a habitat garden right now, and we're specifically keeping an area that is just bare earth for the bees. But I think it's a question of proportion. You just have to very carefully figure out where you're going to place things and think about the design. And I don't think the quail particularly need wood chip mulch, but they might like a more native oak leaf mulch or something like that. And if you keep it relatively thin as opposed to very thick, you're probably pretty safe. And then as far as the ice plant goes, there are many, many, many native plants, non-native succulent plants you could use. You could use Senecio, for example, in lieu of the ice plant. And so it's once again, it's just a question of knowing what's available out there and kind of fine-tuning the design to achieve the goals. I think
you're on mute.
And sorry about that. In terms of creating a habitat garden, it's about creating a lot of different variety in habitat types. Things need basics to live: food, shelter, and water, and so and all different animals and pollinators need different sources of food throughout the year. So I think if you plan the general structure of the garden around the basics of defensible space and that flame height ratio, and then in the planting areas that you can then include based on that, you increase the diversity throughout the year so that there's places for things to hide and lots of different pollinator food throughout. I think that you can achieve both, but there is always some compromise when it comes to defensible space. You don't just want to have like a bare dirt ground, so it's tough.
Yeah. Another person on that note said, quail at our place love the areas with nothing but dry cut grass left on the ground after weed whacking. So
that's probably more their native environment. That's probably more their native environment.
I wanted to also mention that a lot of people, like in that 5 to 30 foot area, a lot of people think, I have to just kind of do it in this 2-dimensional planting where it's wide and flat. But for instance, if you had a 5-foot shrub and its flame length would be 10 feet, right? So if you had a 5-foot shrub in the middle of your mosaic and around it you had, 10 feet to either side of a low growing something or other, that would suffice too, because you're isolating that flame if it catches. So you don't, you can think outside the box. You don't have to do it. It's not just this mono design culture. You should be able to take some of these bigger concepts and really bend them to serve you.
Thank you. The next questions, I've got two that relate to glazing. So Seth, are there some windows that are better than others with respect to fire protection? For example, aluminum clad versus steel versus vinyl versus fiberglass. And the second point is, that getting the right window spec is really important, especially with coastal homes with the most vulnerable side being west facing, that have these huge panels of glass. I know that the code requires tempered glass, at least one panel, or one of the exterior side of the glass window. But can you answer that question about materials?
Yeah. So obviously, vinyl. If it's flammable or it melts, it's a bad choice. It lowers the time that you can be exposed to high temperatures. There is some fire rated windows out there, and I apologize, I can't come up with the exact numbers, but it's something like 30 seconds of exposure before a window will expand and then crack out. And the fire windows, they add, maybe it's 2 seconds or something like that. It's not dramatic. You're much better having a plan preemptively to move stuff away from windows. That's really the best choice.
Okay. Another question here. Do gels or foams have a good track record to protect structures? If so, any specific ones that are better than others? And you might also want to mention the products that you carry.
So yeah, I will. Thank you. So I'm a authorized dealer for a company called WaveGuard, and it's a external fire suppression system. It's completely autonomous, and I won't go on and on about it, but some of the things that it does are things that you should be looking for in a fire system, and that is autonomous. That meaning it has its own water, its own power, and that it turns on and shuts off by itself. And as far as the the additives, there are so many of them. And so like Phos-Chek, you have to be really careful. Some of them they're finding, when you add heat, they become cancer causing. Some of them, they will stick to your building, and getting them clean after the fire does nearly as much damage as the fire. Some of them aren't good for plants, so you'll ruin your landscape. But there are also products that are really wonderful. We use a company or a product called Micro Blaze Out, and it's kind of like a soap. Another thing, like the gels, gels are like Knox gelatin, right? And they suck moisture out of the air. And so if they're exposed to a really humid climate, or somehow they pull water out of the air, they aren't usable. They're just a big chunk in the bottom of your can. Micro Blaze Out is like a liquid, so for years it can sit there. You don't have to shake it, stir it, or anything. And so those are some of the qualities you should be looking at, because really what you want to do is minimize your obligation in making sure that it works. Because you do have to, if you put in an external fire suppression system, you don't just walk away and 10 years from now when the fire comes hope it works. You need to kind of check it, run it. And that's another thing. Some of these systems, they're one-time use. And so if you set them off, you have to, get new product. You have to, go through the reprogramming or whatever. And that's another thing you should be careful of. You don't want to, you want to be able to test your product and make sure it's working. And if you do test it, you don't want to have to start over and buy a new one. Does that answer your question?
I hope so, yeah. Just back to a previous question, we were talking about windows. We talked about the window assembly, but is there a particular glass spec that you've seen out there that is more effective than others?
No, so the glass really isn't the problem. The glass is fine. What the problem is the frame around it doesn't expand, and the glass does. They change shape. One changes shape faster than the other. So that's the problem, right? It just cracks. There's no room for it to go, and it cracks on itself. And so, I'm sure you could add, thickness. There's different things you could do to kind of slow that heating process, right? There's more mass to heat, etc. But generally speaking, no, windows are the vulnerability. They're the weak spot. And so, as somebody mentioned earlier, these massive west-facing windows that are, over a slope and looking over this beautiful wooded area below, well, they're a vulnerability. They are the vulnerability.
And you mentioned shutters, like metal shutters, steel shutters. They can help.
Absolutely. It doesn't take much to prevent that heat or to lower that heat so that it's not affecting the windows in a negative way. And if you put metal shutters over there, the windows can break. It doesn't matter. The embers still can't get in. So, replacing
those
windows.
are retro.
Go ahead.
Those are retrofittable. Those can be retrofitted, so homeowners can put that on their homes.
Yes, absolutely. There's some pretty discreet ones available too, and they kind of have dual purpose. If it's a second home and you're in a rural place, you can close them up, and they provide security too.
Mm-hmm. Super. Well, that is it for the. Okay. One more last question. Seth, can you turn on your system remotely if fire starts while someone's on vacation or away?
Well, so my system, it's controlled internally by IR3, right? Infrared, and on 3 different spectrums. They check out the colors. Some are heat, right? But this is infrared sees through smoke better. So if you're doing a heat reading, for us, this is our choice. But long story short, yes, you can activate it remotely, but you shouldn't need to. You might do it because you want to get your friend wet who's laying at the pool or something like that. And you could go ahead and do that. Another function of ours, we're all over the place. So there's a bunch in Arizona, and there's a roof cool feature. So they just hit the roof cool feature and lower the temperature of their house by putting some water on the roof for 10 minutes,
Yeah. The system that is around our house is called FosCheck, and that's a foam base that mixes with water, and that we're able to connect that to a phone line. So you call a certain number and it will trigger that system. So there are ways to do it.
Cool.
Okay. Well, it's 1:15. I think I think we answered everyone's questions, and I just want to thank all of our panelists here for being out and putting so much work into this presentation. We will, Christy will let you know that when this presentation is available on the AIA Monterey Bay website. And we'll also provide you some resources that we spoke about today, some plant lists that Marie mentioned, and we can provide a number of other links to some of the information that was here today. So thank you all for attending, and stay tuned. We'll be bringing on more webinars in the coming months.